Hello and welcome to COVID Conversations here on WNCU 90.7 FM. I'm Kimberly Pierce Cartwright, your host. We're using this platform here on Zoom to talk about how the virus is affecting how we live today. My guest today is April Dawson. She's a professor at North Carolina Central University School of Law. She teaches, among other classes, constitutional law, voting rights, administrative law, and Supreme Court seminar. And she also co-hosts the Legal Eagle Review, a weekly radio show which airs on Sundays at 7 p.m. right here on WNCU 90.7. April, hello.
Mhm. Hello, Kimberly. I'm happy to be here on COVID Conversations with you.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to have you. Can we start our conversation with your expertise? I mentioned earlier you have experience in constitutional law, voting rights, administrative law. So talk about your background.
Right. So I actually received my undergraduate degree in computer science from Bennett College, just right down the road in
I didn't know you were a
Borough.
Bennett Bell.
I am a Bennett Bell. I'm a proud Bennett Bell. And after working as a programmer for a couple of years, decided to go to law school. I went to Howard University School of Law and practiced up in Washington, D.C. for about 5 years, and then moved down to North Carolina, started a law firm in Alamance County, which is where I live now. And then I decided to academia. And so I started teaching full-time here at the law school. I've taught a number of courses, torts, constitutional law, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court seminar, administrative law, voting rights. I've started teaching some legal tech courses. And yeah, so I've got a lot of interest. My love is just kind of looking at how the country runs and the way that the law plays into that. One of my greatest joys is, of course, co-hosting the Legal Eagle Review with my colleague, Irving Joyner, and being a part of the WNCU family.
It's our pleasure to have you. Also, you just recently got a promotion, didn't you?
I did. So
Mm.
I am now one of the associate for academic affairs. And so that means that I work very closely with our very new dean, Brownie Lewis. And, we are turning a new leaf. We are dealing with this COVID situation, but we're really excited about the future of the law school, and we're all adapting, but there are some bright things on the horizon. So I'm excited about being in this new role.
Very good. Thank you so much. This past year, Democratic and Republican lawyers have filed hundreds of elections related lawsuits in state and federal courts, putting this election on track to become the most litigated in history. One reason for the deluge is COVID-19, which compelled most states to expand access to absentee and mail in voting, add ballot drop boxes, or tweak deadlines and other requirements. And I want to talk about Americans and all of this mosh of things that have transpired around the vote. When we say Americans have the right to vote, what does that really mean within the law?
Right. So the Constitution gives states the authority to oversee voting in this country. And so that's why we don't have, federal voting laws that say, how many days of early day voting, how many days, how long the polls will be open. All of that is controlled by the states. And so the Constitution certainly recognizes that there will be elections, and in fact, sets forth that the people will elect our representatives for the House of Representatives, and that the people will now vote for senators, even though that wasn't what was said in the original Constitution. But in the Constitution, we've got some amendments that certainly prohibits discrimination when it comes to race and gender and age. So individuals who are 18 or over have the right to vote. But what we don't have in the Constitution is some clearly expressed right to vote. So the Constitution recognizes that there will be elections, gives that authority to the states, tells in the amendments that the states cannot discriminate on the basis of race or gender. but we don't have, the Constitution doesn't provide us with a lot in terms of protecting that right, which is one of the reasons why it was so important that Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because it was with that law that states were prohibited from engaging in conduct that, in fact, diminished people's ability to exercise that right to vote.
So next question then, how can we protect our right to vote? There's so many things that it seem like are assaulting that right. How do we protect it?
So the first thing in terms of protecting the right to vote is to know the history, right? If you don't understand how it was that the right to vote was infringed upon in the past, because what we see is that the same techniques that were used decades ago continue to be used today. So you can't protect what you don't fully understand. So the first thing is to know the history, understand the history, understand how our country works, understand politics and our government works. Thing is that you have to really fully understand how the right to vote is being infringed upon so that you can recognize when it's being assaulted. So there's outright suppression and intimidation. There are also efforts to depress the vote. And so to try and discourage from voting that doesn't necessarily rise to the same level of voter suppression, but how do people go about depressing the vote? So, understanding how all of it works together is really one way in which we protect our right to vote. The other way is to make sure that we are informed about the laws that we have, right? So what do the laws provide? So understanding what that means when we go to the ballot box. What is it that we can expect the states and our local governments to do to make sure that we're protected? So I think the first step is always education. And fortunately, there are some wonderful organizations out there, nonpartisan organizations that exist to inform citizens about the right to vote. So they're not pushing one candidate or the other or one party or the other, but these organizations like Democracy NC, they recognize that we have a more robust, a stronger, a more representative government, federal and local and state government, when more people vote. And so there are some wonderful organizations where folks can get information that's really broken down in a layperson understand way.
So I want to talk about voter suppression next. It's been a key concern in many states, and the result has been like long lines, threats from other countries on our vote, mail obstruction. All of those are evident in 2020. How do suppressed votes translate into power?
So if you are voted into office by a small percentage of the electorate, then you're only responsible for them, even if that small percentage doesn't represent the larger country. And that is, in fact, of course, what's so troubling. People don't vote, right? So the representatives can just look out for the special interests as opposed to the population and the people at large. So there's also concern about why would certain individuals want to suppress the vote? Like what's the goal behind that? And again, it's not wanting to have to be accountable to certain segments of the population. And so if they don't exercise their right to vote, different segments, then the people who are in power, people who were to be elected, are not accountable to those people, and who they look to protect are the special interests that may not include people that look like me.
Okay. This is a big concern of mine too. If the final presidential vote tally ends up being close, election experts say that both Democrats and Republicans will likely take the matter to court, increasing the possibility of another Bush v. Gore style standoff in which lawyers and judges, rather than the voters, ultimately determine the next president. Now, everybody is watching for Amy Coney Barrett, her seat on the court would have what possible outcomes if the election goes to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so this is a big concern, and a concern for that shared by a number of folks that are concerned about someone being appointed to the court during this season where people are in fact, voting. And so right now we've got an evenly divided Supreme Court, and so we've got 8 justices. Um, you know, uh, and when we have a 9th justice, Amy Coney Barrett is admittedly a conservative jurist. She was a law clerk to Justice Antonin Scalia. She interprets the Constitution in the same way he did. He is a judge in his same image, and this is, the way she kind of describes herself. And so the concern, of course, is that even if you have a Chief Justice Roberts who is inclined to try and depoliticize the court and who might choose not to have the court weigh in, with Judge Barrett being added to the court and becoming Justice Barrett, that she might side with the 4 conservative justices, making it 5, regardless of what Chief Justice Roberts would do. And of course, the concern is, Trump has appointed Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and now we've got a 3rd justice who will have been appointed by him. You've got Justice Clarence Thomas, who is very conservative, probably the most conservative justice on the court, and then Justice Samuel Alito. So that's a vote of 5 firm conservative justices. And the concern is, we don't know what issues might appear before the court, but the concern that these justices would rule in such a way that it would be in Trump's favor. Now, I do want to say that, any type of issue that the Supreme Court would address would have to come from some state issue. So, for example, you mentioned Bush v. Gore.
Yes.
That was an issue that was presented to the court because there was a recount going on in Florida. So it wasn't as though the Supreme Court was asked to just kind of decide the election. So anything to address would have to come from some state issue. And we don't know what that would be exactly. It could very well be a situation like a recount. And, voting is very different from what it was like during Bush v. Gore. And so, there is that concern, but we're kind of in a wait and see in terms of what issues may arise and what specific issues the Supreme Court may have to address.
Okay. Any post-election day litigation is most likely to involve swing states, critical to determining the Electoral College winner. Like, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and our dear old North Carolina are high on the list of possibilities. And top election officials in these states are really, getting ready for battle. What's the difference between Electoral College, which we hear so much about and we may not know what it is, and popular vote, where we know that one person gets one vote? So talk about the difference between those types of votes in the country.
Sure. So we are not a pure democracy in that everyone votes for the president and, whoever gets the majority of the popular vote wins. We know the case because we saw that in 2016, even though Hillary Clinton won 3
Yes.
million more votes in the popular vote, she
Million.
still lost the election. And she lost it, of course, because Trump, the majority of the Electoral College votes. And so the way the Electoral College is set up is that every state has a certain number of electors, and those electors are based on the number of members of the House plus the number of senators. And so you add those 2 numbers together, and that gives you the elector for that particular state. So vast majority of the states say whoever wins the majority in that state will capture all of those electors. And then after the election period is over, the electors will go to their state capital and they will cast their votes. So that's where you've got the president officially being voted on by the electors. There are a total of 538 electors. And so the president will be the one who gets to 270, which is a majority. And so it could very well work out where you've got the difference in state sizes. So you've got California, who has, one of the largest populations in terms of our states. And you've got then the smaller states. Well, all of the states, regardless of population, actually have 2 senators. And so when you look at it that way and you think about the Electoral College, you've got some of the less populated states actually having a little bit more influence because they have 2 senators, and all states, regardless of size, will have 2 senators. And so that's why you can have a situation where even though you've got one party or one candidate who gets a popular vote, they still may not win because they don't have the electoral votes, which is one of the reasons why. And you mentioned, these battleground states. So, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, North Carolina. That's why you see the candidates spending so much time in North Carolina and these other states, because North Carolina is probably one of the states of all of these states that flips, right? And so we had 2008, North Carolina went for Obama, and then we had 2012 went for Mitt Romney, but it was still a close race. We've got senators that one-term senators. We've got a Democratic governor, even though you had North Carolina go for Trump. So we have a large percentage of unaffiliated voters here in North Carolina, and they have no problem not voting straight down, the party line, and to give serious consideration to each of the candidates. And so, this is one of those states that will be hotly contested. It will be very, very difficult for Trump to win if he does not win North Carolina. And then, of course, we've got a very contentious Senate race going on. And of course, the Democrats are trying to flip the Senate, which will have a big impact. And we can see the impact of the Senate now, because the only reason why Judge Barrett is even in the position where she will be appointed to the Supreme Court is because the Senate is controlled by Republicans. And so they're able to dictate what happens with these federal court appointees.
Well, it's been fascinating, and our time is up.
All right.
COVID conversations in April, it's just been illuminating and fascinating. So thank you very much for spending your time with us today. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking.
You're so welcome. And on the other side of this, we'll know who our new president is. So we're all waiting for that day, probably from the fatigue, if nothing else.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ready to get this done and move on.
Yes. Okay. So thank you all for watching, and thank you all for listening to this edition of COVID Conversations. My guest has been April Dawson of the law school here at North Carolina Central University. We appreciate you listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.